Guys, the whole thing's going to be on YouTube, so you don't need to say hi now, okay? You can say hi later. What's up, everyone? Coming off of Aeos Cup championship run over the last weekend, wanted to make a tier list reflecting my thoughts on the tournament and giving you some insight on some of the picks that I think are strong. Keep in mind, a lot of this is NA oriented because I play in NA. The EU meta is a little bit different, as are the other regions in Latin America, whether that's Brazil, Mexico, Central America, like any of the other regions that have UCS, all have their own individual metas. But my guidance or my tier list is going to be focused mostly around NA and my experience. And we'll get started. So I think the best place to get started are with the Pokemon that were auto banned. So Zacian, just because of its recency and release, and I think some bugs around it, it was not allowed. I also think they wanted to not allow Zacian because it was kind of hard for free-to-play players to access it. So I think that's a primary reason why it was banned. Goodra, Goopa, Gugai, auto banned just because it came out way too recently to the qualifiers. So that wouldn't be fair. Cramorant at the time of the tournament, at the time of the qualifiers, has a bug with its passive ability and its boosted auto, causing it to proc more than it should unintentionally. So that one was automatically banned. And I think for the dedicated Pokemon that were banned purely as Pokemon, that was it. Clefable has a bugged moveset in that Follow Me was disallowed, but the Pokemon itself was okay. And a couple days before the tournament, we found out that there's something related to Comfey and Fluffy Tail that made it unallowed as well. But the Mons themselves were perfectly legal. I think normally I would want to get started based on Pokemon roles. And I think it's a good place to start. Considering I'm the support player for my team and I played a lot of support this weekend, I think it's only fair to start with the support category. The support ones are the ones highlighted with the yellow background. And honestly, all the supports, most of the supports, are pretty good at keeping their teammates alive or disruption or whatever their role might be. I played mostly Blissey throughout the tournament. And while I don't necessarily know if Blissey is an S tier Pokemon on a normal day, for Aeos Cup, the era was different. The way the meta developed within the tournament exclusive to itself, Blissey was just such a high value pick. It provided the ability to shut down Sableye a little bit, keep it contained. The soft boiled sustain throughout the team fights was really good. It's an additional front line. Bliss Assistance, probably the best Unite in the game still, contended with a couple other Unites. And then obviously your boy had some pretty cracked egg bombs. So we made it work. Spragos during the tournament, if you guys watched the official cast, shouted out Inder University. And I guess it's only fair we'll bring back Inder University with a dedicated egg bomb video. So some of the things I plan on talking about obviously are, egg bomb's disruptive tools. The ability isn't that complicated, but I'd say one of the reasons why it is pretty high up in the meta is because it directly interacts with another really popular support, which is Hoopa. I'm going to put Hoopa in the A tier. I think it's a great, very, very good support. I think if this meta had more time to develop, we could easily see this as an S tier Pokemon. In other regions, it might be considered an S tier. But for the meta of this tournament and how the drafts and whatnot played out, Hoopa wasn't seen as the same priority as Blissey. And the reason why I say they interact with one another is because Blissey's Egg Bomb has the ability to knock people into the air. And if Pokemon are airborne when they're trying to go under Hoopa's hyperspace hole, they actually won't be able to go in. So it's a direct counter to Hoopa's hyperspace hole. All in all, Blissey serves as a soft counter. Hoopa still gets to do what it wants. It gets to put its portals in 4 locations to reset its team. It has the only Unite move in the game that does what it does, in that it can reposition your entire team instantly. It's a really good laner. It's a ranged character, so it naturally benefits from the red buff to slow people down. It's got a stun in the early game. It's incredibly mobile. Like, all in all, if I were to make an isolated tier list, remember, if it wasn't for this weekend in particular, I'd say Hoopa is the same tier as Blissey, if not higher. But if we're going to talk about what went down in the Aeos Cup, I think it's fair to keep Hoopa on the A tier. Hoopa's other counterpart as a range support is Eldegoss. And I would put Hoopa and Eldegoss within the same tier. I'm not sure if we got to see a lot of Eldegoss within the tournament, but it's a Pokemon that's always, looked at as a Pokemon that's beside Hoopa. There's only 2 range supports in the game, so naturally they use Muscle Band and Red Buff really well. Comfey's technically the 3rd one now, but it doesn't operate as like a pseudo ranged attacker in the same way. Hoopa's benefits, or Eldegoss's benefits to Hoopa, are that the healing is a little bit more immediate and in combat. The early game is slightly better as, you have a lot more damage with your basic attacks. The Unite move, again, instantly can heal your team as opposed to Hoopa having to reset you, make sure everyone goes to the portal, and can get back out as well. So I'd say they're kind of even. On a normal day, I might put Elda a little bit lower than Hoopa, but I'd say for the weekend, they'd probably be on the same tier. While we're on the topic of characters that are supports and arranged, Comfey's natural next one to talk about. Well, I didn't get to play a lot of Comfey in the tournament personally as a support. I think I played 2 games of it. It was a character that drew out a lot of bans from both teams, whether it was my team, opposing teams we played, or other teams during the tournament. Comfey also just enables so many different strategies. You can play Comfey or Shifu, right, and have this diving water bear running at enemy backlines, being incredibly hard to kill. You can have Comfey Dodrio, which, is a combo we saw a lot during the tournament. Comfey's a soft counter to Dodrio and one of the best Dodrio enablers. And keep in mind, in the draft pick and ban phase, once one Pokemon is selected for one team, the other team can't select it for themselves. So taking Comfey means you've got a counter to Dodrio and the best Dodrio pairing as well. So that's really nice. It counters it by Magical Leaf, just automatically targets the Dodrio and stuns it after a little bit. Once you stun Dodrio, it loses its sprint gauge. But Comfey has so many Pokemon it brings online. It brings online Tyranitar, Dodrio, Zoroark, which we saw a little bit of, any of the Speedsters, really. And in the future, I imagine Comfey will be paired with all sorts of Pokemon. I mean, I could see it being powerful even with Cinderace or Dragapult at some point. We've seen Comfey and Sableye get paired well together, because you can have an untargetable Comfey attached to an invisible Sableye who can be really disruptive. And on the topic of Sableye, it is another supporter. This is another Pokemon that saw quite a bit of play. I will put it in the S tier. It's a Pokemon that we were ready to bring to the tournament, and if you saw my solo queue videos, my solo queue content leading up to the tournament, I would put a lot of practice into this Pokemon. I played it in the qualifiers a week prior. I had a lot of success with it there. I played it in some community tournaments leading up as well. Believed in this Pokemon a lot. I think it's really, really, really powerful. It's got the Poopies. The Poopies are great. We got the Mazo raid as well coming in right when we start the tier list. So I love it. What's up, Mazo? What's up, fellow champion? Mazo and his team won in Brazil, so shout out to them. Like I was talking about Sableye, it's got the Poopies in feint attack, so it provides your team with global vision. It walks around. It's really, really disruptive. I'd say shout out to Spinal. They probably represented this Pokemon the best. They've got a top 4, a team that didn't have major top finishes throughout the year. They really they did a great job piloting this Pokemon. And I think Blissey's resurgence came a lot as a result of Sableye. Blissey does a great job counteracting Sableye's presence around the map. It's tanky. It's a Pokemon Sableye can't really knock out. Plus assistance is really strong into it. If your team comp can ever afford to go Safeguard, it's a direct counter to Sableye as well. So these Pokemon, I think, hand in hand exist in the S tier. But even if Blissey exists in the game, Sableye is still pickable. This character it provides too much global vision, and it's too disruptive for a lot of the backline carries in the game, I'll talk more about Mew and the 3 EVs, but Sableye can really be annoying for those Pokemon. So what do we have left to round out the supporter pool? We've got Clefable. Clefable's, almost kind of like Blissey light in a way. It's another pink blob that heals. It, doesn't have that single target healing and supportiveness that Blissey has, but it does have the healing on an AoE. it's disruptive with gravity in a way that Egg Bomb can kind of be disruptive as well. But again, it's in a larger AoE. The laning phase is kind of similar. They both evolve at level 4. So the early game can be a little bit weak and they're not ranged. But they kind of scale into the game and very, very similar in the end. I would say Blissey kind of outperforms just because Blissey 1 has a much better passive. In that natural cure, you just get to walk out of CC for free. And Bliss Assistance is just so good. Clefable's Unite, whatever it's based off of Metronome, can be a little bit unreliable at times. You know, I'll have days where I roll Hyper Beam and I'm getting all the secures. I'll have days where I get block when I need it, block when I don't need it. And then days where I just roll Splash or Close Combat and it doesn't really perform very well. If Follow Me was allowed, I think this Pokemon would be an S tier mon. Follow Me, I think, is such a superior move to Gravity. Follow Me counters all the things Gravity would counter and more, and it provides bulk because that shield is just insanely strong. But Follow Me was bugged at the time of the tournament, so the admins made the decision to not allow it. Yeah, I mean, I wish Follow Me was allowed. I really enjoy that move. You can blame Zug for getting it banned. It's all his fault. Next up for the supporter category are the 2 tank Pokemon. These Pokemon, even though they're classified as supporters, traditionally get played as more of defenders or tanks. Wigglypoof, this is a Pokemon that we saw more play of this weekend. Something that you don't normally get to see. But with the draft phase implemented, you know, once one tank gets picked up, the other team doesn't have access to it. Some of the defenders draw out a lot of bans. So in a world where Trevenant and Slowbro, probably the best defenders in the game, are unavailable to pick, you have to go down the tank pool and find whatever else is available. We have, you know, one of the best, if not the best, Wigglypoof player in the world. So, you know, Zugrug, when he asked for it, we let him play it, you know, obviously. But we saw other teams pick it as well. Our opponents in the finals or in the winners finals, I don't remember which set of games it was, they took it away. And we saw a couple other teams pick up the Wigglypoof as well. Its Unite move does pretty well into things like Blastoise and Urshifu, giving your team shield and global, like AoE unstoppable, which is nice. But it does have some glaring weaknesses. You know, it's a Pokemon that needs to engage with its CC move. You know, it doesn't have a lot of outs. It doesn't have its own sustain. The Unite move shield isn't very powerful, but I think it's a solid B tier Pokemon. It's it does its job and it does its job well. And it's pretty good. But you can see a lot of the supporters are classified pretty highly, and I think they're all good. We just don't see multiples of these on the same team because they all individually fulfill their own roles and the other spots need to go to other types of Pokemon. But the last one is Mime. Is one of the Pokemon that's probably seen the biggest downfall of all the supports, where at one point it was an S+, SS++ tier Pokemon, with Power Swap being so strong, Confusion being strong, doing so much damage. You know, at one point Psychic was busted when this Pokemon got its rework. Since then, the Pokemon has seen a big downfall. The other defenders do the job of defender much better than Mime. And while Mime does have its niche in that Confusion is still a decent laning move, its Unite move can be still quite annoying. Pokemon just doesn't seem to keep up with the other defenders in the game. And it didn't perform that well this weekend. We didn't really see it get picked. I don't think I remember a game where I saw Mime. But, you know, Mime is a Pokemon that can get played. So I don't think it's an awful Pokemon. I wouldn't put it in the D or the F tier. I think the F tier is Pokemon that, you know, you're almost trolling if you pick them. The D tier, they're really suboptimal. C tiers, you know, they've got their niche. Sometimes they could be okay. That rounds out the supporters, and I think it's only natural to talk about defenders because supporters and defenders in Pokemon Unite kind of share similar responsibilities. We can talk about one of the Pokemon that Mime would maybe be a response to if it was more popular, and that's Snorlax. I think Snorlax is a better pick than Mime, and it could probably exist on the same tier as Wiggly. You know, if I was really specific about it, I'd probably put it like right in between. But specifically for the Aeos Cup, we didn't see a lot of Snorlax. Some of it's going to be due to the fact, obviously, that other defenders are really good. Partially due to the fact that, you know, it fulfills a very similar role to Wiggly, and Wiggly just barely edged out in terms of play over the weekend as well. But I think, you know, if the meta was reset and it had more time to develop, we would see Snorlax be a much better Pokemon. But over this weekend, I think it's fair to say that C tier is probably an okay place to put it. Let's talk about the Titans of the Defender pool, Slowbro and Trevenant. I think these are Pokemon that you can easily put into the S tier. If I were to label the tier in order, Slowbro is probably the most contested Pokemon in the game, if not one of the most contested, if not the most contested. Single-handedly, it shuts down any Speedster you want with its Unite move. Pokemon is very, very hard to bring down, especially when defending pads. Both Surf and Scald are really oppressive during the laning phase, but throughout the game as well. And it's Pokemon that just doesn't have a lot of weaknesses. You can almost never count yourself out of the game if you do have Slowbro. So it's an exceptional Pokemon, and it performed really well during the weekend. And Tree, for very similar reasons, very disruptive with the new Woodhammer buffs. Pain Split buffs keep it alive alongside its passive ability and just its overall bulk. It's definitely not on the same tier as Slowbro, and I might even feel comfortable putting it down a tier. To be honest, yeah, I think I'd bring it down a tier almost, because I want to make a distinction that Slowbro is, at least for the weekend that we played, the superior tank pick. Trevenant has the benefit of it being flexible throughout different roles. But both of these Pokemon do face weaknesses into a lot of the long-range mage Pokemon. Particularly, Delphox is the only Pokemon in the game that has true anti-healing. And both these Pokemon really rely on their healing, especially Trevenant. And they're also just large bodies that can provide resets for characters like Delphox. So I think for this weekend in particular, and the success that it had, I will bring it down to the A tier. And I think that's a good point to also have a segue at looking at the win rates for some of these Pokemon as well. Poker PKU posted some stats on Twitter. I'll link their Twitter for you guys as well. So this is from the Aeos Cup. I'm not sure I think this is exclusively to NA. And you will see the win rates of some Pokemon. Blastoise, Pokemon we haven't talked about yet. But it is, it was really present throughout the weekend as well. Trevenant's got a sub 50% win rate. Slowbro's got a above 50% win rate. Some of the supporters we talked about, like Blissey, 60%, Clefable, 30%. It's hard to use win rates as an absolute when it comes to like such a small environment. And I've talked about this during my streams before as well, is I wouldn't take win rates as an example of really what's going on, right? You might see win rates might just be a representative of teams being able to draft the Pokemon when they're in good positions, right? Sylveon is a 61% win rate. Does it mean if you pick Sylveon every game, it's going to win 6 out of 10 games? No. It might just mean the teams that picked Sylveon knew when Sylveon was good. And of those teams, on average, they picked Sylveon in good position, so it won more games, right? It might mean that Hoopa has a really low win rate, but perhaps it has a low win rate because it was going up against things like Blissey, right? And maybe the Blissey had a good matchup in the Hoopa, or the teams picked Hoopa alongside characters that weren't that good. So it's kind of tough to evaluate purely just on win rate. Slowbro Tree at the top of the tier list for defenders. And it leaves a couple other Pokemon that don't really get to shine as defenders that much. We saw a lot of Blastoise play. And again, while its win rate was abysmal throughout the weekend, I wouldn't say that that's a product purely of its strength as a Pokemon. I do think it might have been a little bit overrated and overhyped by a lot of teams. But the Pokemon excelled. I think I'm gonna put Tree back in the S tier, because one thing about Tree and the same thing about Blastoise is that these Pokemon are able to be played in different roles. So Tree isn't exclusive to be played as a defender. I think maybe in the defender role, I might not put it as high because it does struggle in the early game, but it can be played as a core, which we saw a lot of Blastoise as well, right? Stacking Blastoise, stacking Tree, Energy on Blastoise, and just being used as like an all-rounder almost. So Pokemon struggled I think teams were really, really well prepared to play against this Pokemon, but it doesn't change the fact that it was a centerpiece for a lot of teams' drafts, and it got picked a lot. We saw some teams pick it as a traditional defender, and we saw some teams pick it as a top laner, as a jungler. Such a versatile Pokemon, but also filled with a lot of counters as well. Talking about Mamo next, you know, I think that it goes in the same tier as Snorlax and Mime, as it's not your first choice as defender. You're going to pick it when Slowbro and Trevenant are already taken away. You'll see a lot of teams default to Wiggly. Some teams might go Mime, Snorlax, and some teams might go to Mamo. Definitely still a decently strong Pokemon, but it does struggle a little bit. It's not as tanky as it seems. It can oftentimes just get, you know, chunked out by a lot of the ranged mage Pokemon. You know, take one Espeon combo to the face, one Hyper Voice to the face, and you've lost, you know, you're down to like 10 to 20% HP. And it's a Pokemon that has no way to recover that health, not even with its Unite move like Snorlax does. Greedent, I would say this Pokemon probably goes down to the D tier. For our first D tier Pokemon, doesn't really serve a purpose in the current metagame. I think EU tried some score comp stuff. Maybe it fits in there. But we just didn't see a lot of success. Normally, this Pokemon was played in a similar role to Blastoise, where it's played more as an all-rounder than an actual defender. But Greedent just isn't particularly amazing at anything. Not particularly strong at anything, probably D tier. I'm going to put Crustle beside it. I do think Crustle has some unique characteristics. It didn't get to show itself off during the tournament, but I don't think it's a Pokemon that I would consider you're trolling if you pick it. A lot of people associate Crustle with like Shell Smash and running around and scoring and being a worse version of Greedent. The way I look at Crustle is it's got Rock Tomb, one of the best slows in the game. It's disruptive, but it's very, very niche. And it's hard to pick this Pokemon very effectively. I do think in draft, you know, it's a decent counter pick to Espeon, just because it can lock down Espeon in its Rock Tomb, and Espeon has no way of getting out of it. The problem is that they're normally going to be facing off in lanes against each other. And Espeon being one of the best laners in the game, Crustle not being one of the best, it does struggle a lot. Not the F tier, but not a great Pokemon either. Anyways, I think that rounds out the supporter and defender categories. I feel pretty confident about this. Again, you know, some Pokemon could maybe move up or down a tier. I think maybe Clef could be down a tier. But we saw, you know, Clef put in some work. If Clef had followed me, I think I might move it up even a little bit. But you can see that a lot of the supporters and defenders are quite strong in the game. And it just comes down to the style that you want to play and what fits your team composition the best. Anyways, let's talk about Pokemon that are kind of similar to Crustle and Greedent in that they, you know, have been seen to run around the map and cause chaos, and it's a speedster category, right? So we'll start off with Dodrio, probably the most popular speedster we can think of right now. And we'll see where we're placing Dodrio. I think right before the event started, I might have put Dodrio as like a, you know, S+ tier kind of Pokemon. And I do think it exists somewhere between the S and the A tier. It's hard to really put a good reading on it. But I do think this Pokemon, at least for this event, was an S tier Pokemon. We saw it almost banned in every one of the games. And I'll move it like to the middle of the S tier. We saw it banned almost every one of the games in the finals. ASU banned it against us a lot. Obviously, we have Lutano, who's really exceptional on the Pokemon. But we saw teams like, you know, GT, Spinal, even LG, and I'm probably missing a couple teams. A lot of teams brought out their Dodrio, and they had a lot of success with it. Various different builds, Tri-Attack, Drill Pack, whatever it might be. Pokemon also excels alongside some of the really popular supports, primarily Comfey. So it's just a really excellent Pokemon. It does have a lot of popular counter picks within the meta, and a lot of them exist in the attacker category. So we'll definitely talk about those as well. but I do think it is the best speedster easily that's in the game right now. Speaking of speedsters, I would say some of them are not so good. Gengar, it's an awkward Pokemon. Like, I don't know if I feel comfortable putting it in the F tier. It definitely has that niche of like, you know, maybe it gets the first knockout and then it can just reset and go crazy with Dream Eater. And maybe it can just pop off. But at least over the weekend, we didn't see any Gengars really go crazy. Again, I think in this meta, maybe I could see it being a C tier Pokemon. But if we're going purely off of how the meta developed over Aeos Cup qualifiers, group stage round 1, and the official finals for day 2, the games that got picked, it didn't look very good. I feel like it needs a Blissey behind it to be good, and it's really bad against Blissey. But if the meta played itself out, I could see Gengar have some success. But I don't think it's an F tier Pokemon. You know, I think it definitely has its viability. You know, in draft, anything can work. You know, enemy teams can go very squishy oriented lineups. It doesn't have an awful matchup into Hoopa either, because it can burst people before they get to go off in portals. And if a team goes a really greedy draft with like Hoopa and a bunch of EVs, Gengar can be a really strong pick. You know, if I want to put some of the other speedsters around it, I think Zoroark is slightly better. I might put it into the B or the C tier. I think I'll go with the B tier. I think this Pokemon did see some success. It's got a decent matchup into its other speedster counterpart in Dodrio. It does really well with some of the supporters like Comfey, even though there's a weird interaction with Illusion. It excels with Blissey. Doesn't have an awful laning phase. You know, it tends to stay strong throughout the game. You do need to snowball with this character, and you do need to stay ahead for it to excel. So I don't think it's an A or S tier Pokemon. Maybe with the buffs that we just looked at, we might advance it. But I do think B tier is probably pretty comfortable to put this Pokemon at, particularly with its Feint Attack and Shadow Claw moveset. Talonflame, Absol, and Zeraora. I think I'm gonna put Zeraora. I'm gonna put it in the F tier. Probably the first F tier Pokemon. I think it could exist in the D tier, right? But every time I see this Pokemon, it just doesn't. I'm so hopeful that this Pokemon does well, and it just never ends up doing well. It's a Pokemon that needs to snowball. Reaper, thanks for the Prime. It's a Pokemon that needs to snowball like other speedsters, but it lacks the kit to allow it to snowball, right? It's a character that comes online at level 6 and level 8 with its abilities, where almost every Pokemon in the game are 5 and 7 or 4 and 6. So it's not a Pokemon that has a kit to snowball, but it needs to snowball. So by design, it's just such an awkward design Pokemon that I think it has to sit in the F tier. I do think that, you know, it has the potential to rise in a good draft, and maybe some teams can prove us wrong by making it work. But I just haven't seen its success. Talonflame and Absol, I'll pair together and put them also in the D tier. Maybe Talon could move up to the C tier. We didn't see much Talon throughout the weekend, so I will just put it. I'll put it at the top of the D tier if anything. These Pokemon, like I said, like speedsters, they need to snowball. They have it in themselves to be able to snowball. But with the prevalence of such strong healers in the meta and strong disruptive defenders and supporters, these Pokemon struggle to get online and to snowball and to have good fights around Rayquaza. I think Talonflame has a good secure, so I might edge it out over Absol. Absol Comfey, we've seen in the past be okay, but it's just a weaker version of Dojo traditionally with Comfey. I think Zoroark's just a better version of Absol in a lot of ways as well. But Pursuit Absol can definitely, you know, I can see some play, and it's not completely the worst. But throughout the weekend, the last couple weeks, we didn't really see this Pokemon live up to its promise. Okay. I guess we'll go with the all-rounder category, starting with Scissor, because Scissor is only half a Pokemon. It exists as Scyther as well. And sadly, this tier list doesn't have Scyther as its individual Pokemon. So I am going to rate this as pretty much exclusively Scyther. Because Scissor is, maybe 1 out of 20 games it's going to be good. So as Scyther, I think this is a solid A tier Pokemon. I think it exists in a tier between Dodrio and Zoroark. I think in the past you might have seen it as the S tier Mon. And it very well could be at some point. But it's just a character that falls so short to Slowbro, which is seen in almost every game. It falls short to Trevenant. It struggles against Sableye. And the defenders and supporters in the game do such a good job locking it down. And teams that like to run really heavy frontline, like Trevenant, Blastoise, with like a Blissey or a Comfey around, it's just harder to get online. I don't know, did Scyther get picked at all during day 2? We might not have seen it during day 2, but I feel like maybe there are a couple games where it was. Day 1 for sure, we did day 1 during the group stage. I do recall some Scyther games where it had some decent results. So I think it's a speedster that exists between those two. As for the other all-rounders, I think Urshifu and Lucario are probably the ones that we saw some of the most of, maybe Tyranitar. We can talk about those. Urshifu, it exists somewhere between the A and the B tier. Definitely a really strong Pokemon. I think within the draft, you can pick this Pokemon at a stage where if the enemy team doesn't have enough counterplay to it, and if they're not very well prepared, it can completely run over a game. But most teams are always considering what the implications of their team will be if the other team picks an Urshifu, right? So they always have some kind of options prepared against, right? Some range damage healers that can kite it. Not too many Pokemon that can get disrupted by it. And even though it does have one of the best secures in the game, if you go Red Urshifu, or it can be one of the strongest snowball characters in the game if you go Water Urshifu, the Pokemon still stands as one of the worst level 1 Pokemon in the game. 1 through 4 in the Cub Fu stage is so awful. It's a liability to the team. It almost forces to go into the central area, which means that you don't have access to really early game powerful mons in the jungle, like Glaceon that we'll see talk about in the tier list. And it just takes away the central area from Pokemon that might want it a little bit more. And even then, it does require levels to get online. So it struggles, but despite that, at its strengths, it's still an A tier Pokemon. Luca, and this probably is going to be maybe a hot take for some people, but I actually think it's a solid A tier Pokemon. Is it S tier? No, these Pokemon in the S tier definitely live in a world of their own. But, we had a lot of success with Celestial playing Lucario in NA. We played it day 1 of the tournament. We played it day 2. We played some of it in the qualifiers. It's unlike Urshifu. This Pokemon has no weaknesses throughout the game in terms of its level. It's strong at level 1, and it's strong at level 15, and it's strong all throughout the game. So, it's a Pokemon that almost never exists as a liability. Maybe there's certain strengths that other Pokemon have that edge over on it. And maybe Urshifu's version of Power Up Punch does a little bit more damage. Might be slightly better secure. Maybe its Unite move's not the best in the game. But, it's got that versatility. Like Water Urshifu, it can snowball with extreme speed early game and take the game over. Like Urshifu with Power Up Punch, it can give you a really strong, bulky frontliner kind of all-rounder that can put pressure on backline characters without all the drawbacks that Urshifu has. I think, like Duder said, it's the roundest of all-rounders for sure. So yeah, I like Luca at the A tier. I'm glad you guys agree as well. Next comes some of the more you know, controversially kind of Pokemon. Tyranitar. The only loss we had of day 2 was the game where we picked Tyranitar. And we saw some teams pick Tyranitar without a healer, and that struggled as well. We saw some teams have some success with Tyranitar as well. Tyranitar's problem, though, is that it just doesn't do very well into many ranged Pokemon. And there's so many ranged Pokemon in the meta. There's Sylveon, there's Delphox, there's Mew, there's Glaceon, there's Espeon. All these Pokemon do such a good job kiting it. And it takes so much of your priority from your healers, like so much attention, that it's just not the Pokemon that it was even 2 weeks ago. People are so good at playing around Tyranitar that it is really easy to kite. And it's a liability, right? Like, you need to get to level 9 to come online. Level 5 through 9 is pretty hard. You know, I can just get ignored in its Pupitar stage. And even the tanky Pokemon that it's meant to be decent into, like, you know, Blastoise and whatnot, they just kind of outdamage it in the team fight. So too much of a liability, too easy to kite. I think other Pokemon are just, you know, just going to edge out over it. But, you know, we might see a resurgence at some point if there's a meta shift that happens. Pupitar is very, very, very sad. Is it better to just go Venu, Blast over T-Tar? Yeah, I mean, Venu and Blasters do very similar jobs, but just better, for sure. Which is funny because neither of those are all-rounders. If you didn't catch it earlier, why Cram is auto-banned, there's a bug during the tournament, during the qualifiers for the tournament and the finals as well, with its passive and its auto attacks triggering more than it should. So the admins made the call to keep it banned. So let's talk about Garchomp, which is almost like Tyranitar's counterpart. In that, like, you know, it's a pseudo legendary melee all-rounder, sometimes gets kited a little bit. I think this Pokemon kind of exists in the same plane as T-Tar, in that, you know, you need to get it evoluted. It needs attention from the supports. It is a slightly better laner. And it is better at accessing the backline than Tyranitar is. But at the same time, it still has similar liabilities to Tyranitar, in that it's, you know, mid-game can be quite weak. And it draws a lot of attention from the supports. I just don't think it's good enough to put into the B tier. I do think it's better than Tyranitar, so, you know, I'll put them on opposite ends of the tier. I just don't think it's good enough to say this is B tier, you know? I think I feel comfortable keeping this kind of gap here. At least throughout the tournament, I don't think I really saw Garchomp go too crazy. Maybe the meta develops a little bit more and it ends up etching it out. But, you know, Garchomp is a lot squishier than Tyranitar is in team fights. So while it is harder to kite a Garchomp, it's a lot easier to just randomly bring it down. And maybe, you know, in the EU meta, the teams are better at Garchomp. The way the lanes play out, people put more prioritization on Garchomp. Might be etched out. I can only speak for NA. And, you know, this is a NA kind of tier list. So I'll put it where he's at for now. Let's see, what are some of the other all-rounders that we've got? I think Azumarill probably exists on a plane below these all-rounders. It just doesn't do anything particularly great. Like, it's got a good early game-ish, but it needs to snowball pretty hard to be effective. And even at its peak, it's just not strong enough to really keep up with the rest of the Pokemon that are out there. Serena, I'm gonna have to put in that F tier. You know, it's kind of like Zera in that it's a Pokemon that needs to snowball to excel, but doesn't really have the tools to excel in the early game. And then even when it does, you know, it's usually going to be on par, like equal level to its counterparts. And it's just not good enough to, you know, stay in the game when other Pokemon like, you know, Scyther, Shifu, Lucario exist that fulfill like similar kind of roles, but better. Serena's early game is just too weak. It's one of the only all-rounders that, you know, doesn't have that kind of 5 spike. Its 5 spike is instead at level 6. You know, it does get its Stomp or Axel at 5, but, you know, Luca just being instantly online for the first Bs or Shifu being online there, Serena's just not the same. So even though this Pokemon once used to be really good, I just don't think it's there anymore. Machamp, on the other hand, you know, it's an interesting Pokemon. I think it exists somewhere between the B and the C tier. I'm trying to think if I saw any Machamp. Personally, I remember some Machamp during the qualifiers. And I saw a lot of the teams go crazy in the qualifiers of this Pokemon. I think day one during the group stage we saw it as well. I don't know if for the finals if it was there much. But some of that just has to do with you know, teams not favoring it. Lucario going pretty uncontested, so not much of a reason to go Machamp over Luca. But Machamp, you know, it's a Pokemon that has a really good early game. You know, Karate Chop, incredibly strong, secure in the lane. Bulk Up, giving you free boosted auto and unstoppable, and some mobility in the lane is good. Its Unite move is a little bit predictable, so it's pretty hard to get big Unite moves in competitive games. But I think, you know, you can never count on a Machamp that has its eject button up. Dynamic Punch eject combo to instantly put you on a backline and nuke it is really, really strong. If you combine that with Unite moving at first, you know, you can definitely catch people off guard. But I think a lot of the good teams will always keep in mind that there's a Machamp on the other team. So they'll watch the flanks that they know it's going to come from. And, you know, you can always eject a Machamp that you see coming at you. And if Machamp burns its eject, it's really, really hard for this Pokemon to get on to the backline characters that it's designed to kill. So, you know, if teams are really good at playing around it, I think it's tough to get value off of it. But it's a Pokemon that can draw out a lot of resources. It's a good laner, doesn't require a lot of support from the team. And for that reason, I think it's a solid B tier Pokemon. Aegislash, I think, is similar to Machamp in some ways, in that it's an okay Pokemon to start the lane. But then after it starts evolving throughout the game, it definitely has its differences. Oops. Aegislash, a much weaker Pokemon, you know, until it hits level 7. But it is a Pokemon that has a good secure in its Unite move. Has decent matchup into some of the Speedsters. Wide Guard can make it really, really tanky. If we see more Hoopa presence in the meta, Aegislash automatically goes up, because one of the really popular combos with Aegislash is Aegislash goes into its Wide Guard. You put a Hoopa portal right underneath it, and you can't burst it through Wide Guard because it's too tanky with the shield, and it's unstoppable, so you can't knock it out. And then Aegislash gets to reset, Sacred Sword onto the backline again, slash, go into Wide Guard, reset with Portal. Like, these Pokemon are so good together. But besides that, you know, it struggles to come online in the early game. Doesn't really have a presence in a lot of the team fights. The angles that it needs to play out are kind of predictable at times. So Pokemon struggles to perform exceptionally. But I do think it's an all-rounder that, you know, we'll see get picked from time to time. And definitely saw some teams play it during the qualifiers. I think I remember seeing at least 1 or 2 Aegislash games in day 1 of the tournament as well, throughout the group stage. So Pokemon that I think definitely has potential, but not as consistent as some of the other all-rounders. Let's see. The final 2 all-rounders are Dragonite and Charizard. Oh, I guess there's Buzzwole. Buzzwole is a Pokemon that kind of gets slept on too. It goes into the B tier for this tournament, and only because Pokemon has an incredible matchup into one of the most popular Pokemon in the game, and that's Blastoise. Buzzwole's superpower actually takes Blastoise out of Rapid Spin and completely cancels the move. And for that reason, and the fact that it's got an incredibly strong early game, Pokemon's definitely in the B tier. Yeah, we see it picked in EU. NA picked it a lot actually too. I don't think it goes into the A tier, but I think it could be as strong as an A tier Pokemon as well. But I think it's a solid B tier Pokemon, probably better than Machamp even. Put at the top of the B tier for B for Buzzwole. So solid Pokemon. It's got some good counterplay into Buzz, decent counterplay into Hoopa. It does struggle a lot into Clefable though. Clefable's gravity and Follow Me once Follow Me gets fixed, but primarily gravity completely shuts down everything Buzzwole wants to do. True, it can cancel Covet, but we don't see a lot of that get played at all. The other all-rounder pair, the Dragon pair. Well, I think these Pokemon are probably both playable. And you could probably win games on them. They're just, you know, shadows of what they once used to be in the past. Maybe D-Knight you could put in the D tier, but just the fact that Dragonite's range is a lot smaller than other range characters, and it's just not a great meta to be a ranged auto attacker, period. It's hard to get value with Dragonite. Its Unite move a lot weaker in value compared to other ones as well. Just makes it really weak. Doesn't have a particularly great laning phase. It's pretty strong with Comfey. It is decently strong with Comfey. But so is everything else in the game. And similar idea with Charizard. Takes too long to come online. Its damage is too low. It's seeing a buff come up in the next patch. So maybe that might bring it back. But for now, I just don't think this Pokemon is worth picking up. But the next patch might make things different. Cool. So let's talk about attackers. There's a lot of attackers to go through. We'll pair up the special attackers together so we can talk about these all together. And just talk about the special attack ones first, and then the physical attack ones afterwards. Oh, there's actually such few physical attacker Pokemon. Cool. We'll talk about Mew. One of the best Pokemon in the game. It has very few bad matchups. One of the best laners in the game. Shuts down Speedsters. You know, just the simple fact it can instantly slow down something like a Dodrio with its Electro Ball. It can kite forever with agility. It matches up well against other ranged Pokemon with Solar Beam. It can protect itself with Surf and its Unite move. Like, this Pokemon is just so good. So strong. Definitely S tier Pokemon. Glaceon, another very similar case. To be honest, all the EVs are really, really strong. Glaceon is like the ranged form of an ADC, if you guys are familiar with that. With Icy Wind, you know, and being able to keep up 2 Icy Winds with cooldown reduction items and blue buff, you can instantly take down any other ranged Pokemon in the game. It can almost take down tanks by itself as well. It's just so powerful with Icy Wind, and its ability to secure Rayquaza or other objectives is so crazy. It's mobile within the fight. It comes online at level 4, particularly level 6. So out of the central area, you can take one of the buffs. You don't even need to take both of the buffs and gank a lane really, really quickly. And then there's no reason that these two Pokemon are receiving some of the heaviest nerfs in the upcoming patch. After the patch, I think Mew probably drops down to A or B, you know, closer to B, and Glaceon probably drops to A or B closer to A, because Mew's getting a lot of nerfs with Solar Beam, its move reset, Electro Ball, so many different nerfs. Glaceon's just getting a slight touch up to Icy Wind. But definitely large nerfs coming their way. I think Espeon, also another S tier Pokemon. This Pokemon got a buff to Psyshock and it's boosted recently. Surprised to see that this one isn't getting a nerf. Because while it does have a bigger glaring weakness to Mew and Glaceon, in that it has no mobility for itself, this Pokemon continues to dominate the lane, does an incredible amount of damage. Anyone that lanes with it gets an insane amount of EXP, and has one of the best secures in the game, which, you know, at the end of the day, Pokemon Unite is a game of whoever can get the final objective, and Espeon's one of the best at it. Surprised to see this one doesn't get a nerf. Anyways, we'll top off the final evolution with Sylveon, which honestly, after this weekend, I could put it in the S tier because it did so well, especially in the finals. It had such a big presence. But I will say that Sylveon is one of the evolutions that when it's a bad game for Sylveon, it's a pretty bad game for Sylveon. Like Dodrio is such a good answer to this Pokemon. The other speedsters are good answers to this Pokemon. It struggles into Lucario. Definitely of the three, its Unite move is probably the worst as well. So it's a still really, really strong Pokemon. And it helps support the other evolutions in Mew as well. Its Hyper Voice reduces target special defense by up to 80%, which means that the other special attackers essentially start to deal true damage because they're penetrating so much of that defense. I think it's a really good Pokemon. Maybe not on the same tier as the other evolutions, though. What else? We can talk about Pikachu. I'd say Pikachu, you know, very, very niche. Unlike the other attackers, special attackers in the game, its Unite move comes online at 9 as opposed to 8, which is one of the biggest difference makers when it comes to comparing it to the other range special attackers. It has some decent lockdown, but it's got similar weaknesses that Espeon does, but you know, it's just a much weaker Pokemon compared to Espeon. I'd say the easiest way to look at Pikachu is that it's just a worse Espeon. Yeah, you have Volt Tackle and a guaranteed lockdown, which can be good, but it does put you in harm's way a lot of times. And even just the way it matches up into the other characters, it's hard to get in range to Volt Tackle them, whereas these other characters can play at a much further range. I don't think it's completely troll to put it in the D tier. I think it's an F tier Pokemon. It exists within the plane of these Pokemon. But there's so many other good options that you'd be hard pressed to put it anywhere near there. Ninetales, I will put in a tier below Pikachu. You know, it can have some okay matchups into certain Pokemon throughout the game, but generally speaking, its lane dominance, you know, isn't nowhere near the lane dominance that Mew and Espeon provide. It's a character that, you know, wins the lane by out-trading your opponent, but nowadays the other characters just have such good secure in the lane, they don't really battle you that much. And it's too vulnerable to fight over the mid objective, the mid Bs. It is a little bit tanky, and it can do okay if given the right setup, but in its role, you're going to see other Pokemon get prioritized a lot more. Let's talk about Delphox, because it is Delphox and Guard, because these are similar-ish Pokemon that fulfill a similar type of role. I'd say, I mean, Delphox is so close to being an S tier Pokemon. I think I'll put it right beside Sylve at the top of the A tier, just because I think it is a tier below these Pokemon in particular. But if we saw the meta develop out more, we might see it even get bumped up to something like an S tier. But it does struggle into characters like Dodrio, can at times struggle into Pokemon like Lucario, and its matchup into the other range special attackers in its own role can also be kind of tough. It struggles, you know, at the stage of the game before it gets its levels online. Its Unite move is at level 9, but it's so powerful that you gotta recognize it at the same time. So I think it's a great Pokemon and great at what it does, but not as good as its other counterparts in its role. And for that same reason, I'll put Guard at the leader of the B tier. I mean, it operates very, very similarly to Delphox, but one of the only differences being that Gardevoir's Psyshock comes online way earlier than Delphox's tools come online. Its Unite move is strong, but nowhere near as strong as Delphox. And you can't really pick them side by side. And if I had to pick which Pokemon I think is generally better between Delphox and Guard, I think Delphox edges it out most of the time anyways. So that probably concludes the caster versions of the special attackers. There is Venusaur, who's kind of unique in that it's almost like the ranged attacker version of Blastoise, right? It doesn't really get played with Solar Beam very often, just because the other mages do a much better job at that. Its Unite move is a huge amount of damage, so it does make it really good. But I think it sits right beside Guard in the B tier. The reason for that is that Venusaur does need a lot of levels to come online. Right? You want to put it in the central area at times so it can get its level 9 and it can come online. It needs levels, otherwise it just falls over. And its ability to survive in team fights at times can be the difference between you hitting a Giga Drain and not. It also matches up really poorly into Delphox, right? Delphox is a pretty hard counter, and it's present in a lot of games. It's not great into, Speedsters at times. Dojo can really just, expose it throughout the game. And it does require a lot of attention from its supports, right? You need the Blissey helping it. You need the Clef on it. It doesn't pair particularly great with Hoopa. And, it can just get brought down in a Bro Unite, which, Bro is pretty incentivized to bring down Venusaur as well with its Unite. So I think it's a good Pokemon. We saw some teams run it in the top lane to start off the game and run it similar to a Blastoise, but it's just a much worse version of Blastoise at that point. For people saying that it's A tier if it has a Comfey on it, every damage Pokemon in the game practically gets bumped up a tier with Comfey, right? So we're not going to really, that's not a really great argument for why it should be higher, I think. And that leaves the physical attackers, which honestly, if you think about it, are going to exist towards the bottom of the tier. I'd say we could start out by just labeling which ones are better than the others. And I think this is probably my order of these characters being viable. Decidueye, almost like the other special attackers, and that it does rely on its ability to cast its spells to do damage with Spirit Shackle. But it lacks mobility. It needs to get to level 7. And it needs stacks to really be a powerful Pokemon. And it has, somewhat of a liability in the early game. Not as bad as people make it out to be. But it definitely can be a liability in the early game. And just the fact that you need level 7 and not level 6 for this Pokemon to fully come online puts it at, a tier just below everything else. That being said, if this Pokemon does have a decent early game, you get its attack weight stacks up. It's one of the best Pokemon at securing Rayquaza. It can kind of deal with Slowbro and Tree and getting some good damage onto them as well, which are some of the popular tanks. But too much of a liability, and it's just not as powerful as the other special attackers, obviously. Greninja, I would say, is one of the few Pokemon that is pickable, but it just, the metagame doesn't suit it very well. It's too dangerous to be Surf with all the, small amount of mini suns that exist that can just catch you out. Surf's damage isn't enough of a reset to really make good use of it. And while you can, play around its Unite move to dive the backline characters have such good tools to really peel for themselves that it's hard for Greninja to really have a pop-off game. Unless you're running full heal, the Espeon can just straight up Unite you when you look to dive onto it. Mew has a plethora of tools to be able to deal with that on its own, including its own Unite move, or even just, Surf or Agility. And in the open map, it's hard for Greninja to really trade with Mew. It can get one-tapped by a Glaceon. It can get one-tapped by an Espeon. So it's just a Pokemon that struggles. Dragapult, I think a lot of people might want to see it in the F tier, but I've seen some teams have some good success with Dragapult. Dragon Dance can go ham at times, but generally, it's just not a great meta suited for these types of characters. Similar reasons why Greninja struggles, Dragapult sees a lot of those struggles as well. So I'm going to put these towards the end of the D tier for sure. Cinderace, I'd say, is probably the best of the F tier Pokemon, but a clear distinction between Ninja and Dragapult, that Cinder is just a weaker version of them. So I'll put that in the F tier. Pokemon, you know, all the other popular damage dealers in the game either have an insane amount of burst damage and or have, you know, really good AoE to, you know, contest things like the bees. There's 3 sets of bees on the map. And you know, they have like the ability to peel for themselves. Cinderace has 1 dash, you know, Blaze Kick is obviously pretty good too, but has not a lot of great AoE damage. It's not really good at taking down the bees, so it's hard for it to farm. And it also just gets countered by a lot of the other range special attackers. And I'd say Dura, you know, probably just even weaker version of the bunch. Probably one of the worst Pokemon in the game right now. It's practically its only job is to flip objectives, but this character doesn't get it out of the early game to be able to have a presence in the late game. You know, and then maybe in your solo queue, duo queue, trio queue games, you know, you might think this Pokemon is good because it could just put the fire on the bird and pray for the best. But against good teams, they know that that's Dura's pretty much only option to play the game. So they're going to be at Ray early. They're going to be there ready to go. And no one's going to give it a shot to flip the objective in any kind of serious game. But in other game formats, when people aren't prepared for the flip, it could definitely do some work. How do we feel about the tier list? I see some questions. I think Dura is better than Scizor. Yeah, Scizor here is placed because of Scyther. Scizor itself is pretty bad. Flash Cannon, pretty bad. Can I talk about the band? Can I talk about the potential and turning of those banned ones? Okay, so at the start of the tier list, I did mention these Pokemon were automatically banned, but say they weren't. You know, Zacian would be in the tier above everything else, right? Even with its nerfs coming, this Pokemon is just overtuned, overstated. It's good in every department in the game. It's just too powerful, right? Goodra, I think we would see it probably between the B and the C tier. I think I'm leaning more towards the C tier, around where Mamoswine is. It's just a much worse version of Tree, a much worse version of Slowbro. And it's a Pokemon that takes too long to come online for the role that needs to be online in the early game. So yeah, I don't think this Pokemon would perform very well at all if it was unbanned. And Cram, I think, is a solid B tier mon. I would see it at the top of the B tier. It's one of the only ranged special attackers in the game that's hyper mobile with Diverse Slash. It's decent at contesting things like Dodrio, which are really popular. Its Unite move definitely isn't bad. But this Pokemon will struggle into things like Tree. It can get caught in a Slowbro Surf and just instantly go down. You know, the defenders that are really popular match up pretty well into Cram. And Cram is still a pretty squishy Pokemon, but because of Spoon, I think this Pokemon is definitely viable. So probably Cram B tier, Goopa C tier, and Zacian S+, if they were allowed. Gura probably G tier, I'd say, below everything. Zug says, why do you hate the Dura? He puts the fire on the bird. It's true. But what if the bird's not there yet? That's the problem, right? The bird only shows up randomly at the last 2 minutes. And you could find the fridge and bring it down. I think that's it. It's my perspective. Playing in NA, winning NA. Obviously, I think EU has different takes, different flavors. I think if, like I said throughout the tier list a couple times, if the meta were to evolve without a patch, I definitely think things would change. But based on the meta, I think this is a pretty accurate representation of the Pokemon I expected to get played. With some of the nerfs coming, Mew definitely goes down a couple tiers. Maybe Zoroark moves up a tier. I think Tree goes relatively same. Glaceon stays about the same, maybe down a tier. Maybe Zard becomes playable. But we'll have to see when the patch comes.